Agile coach here at Nelnet until fairly recently. He had signed up to deliver some presentations as part of Agile Camp, and he was able to be here for the Madison camp, but not for the other two. So I foolishly agreed to take over for this presentation for him, called "What You See Is All There Is." So some of this content I've tweaked a little bit for me, and some of it is Brett's original content. I won't go to great pains to highlight which is which, but just so you know, some of it will be kind of obvious too. So the topic origins really were born. Brett had gotten into, he had a recent ADHD diagnosis, and he really wanted to get into how he could think about his thinking. And so he picked up this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, by Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winning, his Nobel Prize is in economics, even though he's a psychologist. So he's worked with, to establish cognitive biases that can lead to perceptual distortion, inaccuracy, poor judgment, illogical interpretation, or what is generally known as just disorder. And so these kinds of things can have an influence on how we look at and think about everything, but we're going to talk specifically about how that stuff applies to our Agile work or our work in general. So today we're going to apply some of that research. We're going to start out as we go through this by first meeting the characters that we're going to talk about during this discussion, and then we'll test your attention and my attention. My attention was already tested, so we're really going to just be testing your attention because I've seen it already. And then we'll talk about different biases and heuristics that can get us that can cause problems for us as we work through our day-to-day. Now these apply in life as much as they do to us, but I'm going to try and highlight some ways that they can really impact us in our day-to-day Agile work. So, meet System 1. This is my dog. This used to be Brett's dog, but now it's my dog. I put my dog in here because he's way cuter, just personal bias. His name is Teddy. My wife likes to call him Ted Stewart because he looks a little bit like Rod the Bod, who I think we can all agree is incredibly sexy. So Ted, we think Ted's pretty special at home, but he's really just pretty much a typical dog. He is what we will call, kind of throughout this presentation, the fast brain. He never stops to think, if I eat this, will it give me diarrhea? Our fast brain is automatic. It's constantly assessing and reacting. It's really bad at statistics, our fast brain. It's kind of a read and react. It's almost always in charge. It's our fight or flight. Okay? So let's talk about character. Oh, I was supposed to click when I talked through all of those things. Yeah. Let's meet System 2. System 2 is Brett's cat because I don't own a cat, I'm allergic to him. So we had to borrow Brett's cat for the talk. And Brett's cat represents our slow brain. Our slow brain is the part of the brain that really makes us humans. It's interpreting statistics, it's checking facts. System 2 is inherently lazy. It doesn't want to work when it doesn't have to, and it's more than happy to let System 1 just take over. It kind of costs a lot to engage System 2, so as humans, we're more than happy to say, let's just give it a swing. Okay, so what you see is all there is, the title of this talk. This is Kahneman talking about what you see is all there is. It facilitates the achievement of coherence and of the cognitive ease that causes us to accept a statement as true. I hope that made sense to all of you because it really did to me. So let me just kind of dumb that down for us all, our fast brains. It's the combination of quick answers from System 1 And the lazy system 2 is the source of most of our biases. That's what you see is all there is all about. So now, we're going to test your biases. Some of you may have seen this before. If so, hang with us. If you haven't, pay attention closely. Count how many times the players in the white clothes pass the ball. Pretty simple, okay? The video's going to come up here. You're going to count how many times the players in white pass the ball. And then we'll test you at the end. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15. How many got 15? Okay, good. That's pretty good. How many got 16? How many got something completely different? 14 seconds. Okay, so here's the question. Here's the question. We just talked about how did you do. How many of you saw the gorilla? How many of you are wondering what I'm talking about? Let's watch it again. Maybe not. Oh, that's right, I have to come forward. Can't fast forward it. You're still wondering what I'm talking about? Still wondering? How many of you had seen this before today? Quite a few of you. That was some of the feedback I got. And Lincoln was that it apparently not. It was the first time I had seen it when Brett did it, but apparently many other people had seen it. System 1 is the cause of our intentional bias. There are things we can do to address that, and we're going to discuss those. So, let's see. Oh, what can we do? We can learn to recognize situations where mistakes are likely and the stakes are high. That's really, the two things go hand in hand. When the stakes are high, we better be paying careful attention. When mistakes are likely, we probably should also be paying careful attention. It's a team effort too, because we are a lot better at recognizing other people's biases than we are at recognizing our own. So let's talk about some situations. We're going to talk about easier questions. We're going to talk about anchoring, availability, and bias in small numbers. But we're going to start with easier questions. So here's easier questions. This is my dog Ted. He says, I don't understand your question. I'll answer an easier one instead. And our slow brain says, you don't need me. So let me ask you a simple question. I ask you guys a simple question. How happy are you with your life? Don't answer out loud. Just think about it. How happy are you with your life? Here's the thing. It's a simple question on its face, except what's involved in there and what may come to mind is, let me just step back. When we say happy, what do we mean by happy? Do we mean that you're laughing? Do we mean that you're joyful? Do we mean that you're satisfied? And when we say life, what does that mean? Work life? Home life? Afterlife? So the way to address this is to think about simpler questions. What is my mood right now? What is my mood right now? More specific, simpler to answer. So if we can break down questions We can force System 2 to engage by asking these simpler, easier questions. What do we mean by happy? What time frame should I reference? What's the scope of the questions? We can find easier to answer questions to clarify the original question. So be aware, and this gets into some of the other presentations that we've had this week, be aware of the language that's being used when you're being asked questions. Because the assumptions you may be making about that may be throwing things off a little bit. Ask easier questions to clarify the original question. So Ted says, ooh, I know what we're talking about, but I need help. And System 2 says, I heard the other questions, let me compile them together and give you an answer. System 2 is helping out, right? Forcing it to engage. Make sense? Question about that one? Before I move on? So, in anchoring effects, now, before I move on, let me just kind of touch on it. I touched a little bit, but when you think about questions that you get in your work day to day, estimating comes up. Estimating is going to be a common theme probably throughout this, because that's really a lot of times where our biases would get us in trouble. But we can make all sorts of assumptions about requirements here, because we're not being specific about language. We can make assumptions about time frame. And of course, face-to-face discussions can help out, because that can help clarify even mood, or body language can help tell us how a person's feeling. So think about those easier questions. Probe. Anchoring effects. So let's talk about anchoring. Anchoring is, master said treat, so this box must be a treat. All I can think about is treats. Sounds right to me. So, somebody finish this sentence for me. Whoever speaks first.
Sets the tone for the conversation.
Yeah. Whoever speaks first actually anchors everything. They anchor the conversation. I heard controls the conversation. A lot of times when you're negotiating for a job, they say if you speak first, you lose. That's one of the things we hear a lot of times about. If you're negotiating for a salary and you speak first, you lose. But that's not really the case in all places, and maybe not even in that one. If System 1 can't ask for help here, this anchoring effect is very dangerous. And we can think about this in terms of estimating, certainly. What do we use to kind of help avoid anchoring in an estimating section? Anybody use planning poker before? So planning poker, if you don't know what that is a process where the people estimating all get together. They have a set of cards with a set of numbers on them, and they use the set of numbers to estimate how hard something, how difficult something is. And then they all turn around at the same time, so that there's theoretically no bias in that estimate. And then you have discussion. So leaders got to be careful about this, because they have stronger anchoring effects than the people that work for them. And I'm sure you've all had that experience where you've been in a meeting and the CIO's there or whatever, and they say something, and all of a sudden everybody in the room agrees with that thing. I once had a guy tell me that he could estimate a project within a certain dollar amount. It was a 6-month-long project. He told me exactly what it was going to cost. And he said, we'll come in within 10% of that. And I said to him, well, is that because, whatever you said is what people are going to eventually build the cost at? And he said, no, I've just been doing this a very long time. Really, I didn't work there very long. So, blind polling is a good way, just like planning poker, is a good way to try and get around estimates. But here's the problem. Anchors are almost always impossible to avoid. It's almost always impossible to avoid an anchor of some sort. Even once you turn the cards around, there's somebody in that room who everybody's going to look at as the expert, and they're going to start thinking, man, my estimate must be wrong. Have you guys ever noticed how if a customer says, I need something by X date, all of a sudden, that's the date that you're going to get it done by? I need something by next week. Can you do it? Yeah, I can do it. You go back to your team and you say, hey, we've got a week to do this thing. So that's something to be aware of. One of the things that I will do, by the way, is intentionally anchor sometimes, because you can go to a person and say, hey, how much is this thing going to cost, or how long is this thing going to take to do? And they're going to say, I can't tell you. I don't know. And you can say, well, it's going to take you a year. It's a ridiculously long anchor, right? And they're going to say, oh, no. Okay. It's going to take you 6 months? No. It's going to take you a month? Well, you can get them thinking. Get them thinking in that range. But you're using that anchor intentionally. You know that you set something, a bias now, that's way out there, and you're trying to probe to get a better estimate out of them when they're not wanting to engage. Developers are great at this now, especially when you tell them they're working in an agile fashion. They all want to say, well, agile doesn't do estimates. It doesn't do time estimates. So that's one of those ways. It's about intentionally anchoring and then moving through. Anchoring and then adjusting. Be careful in your meetings. Help each other recognize absurd anchors. Like, you get that done in 2 weeks, right? So at the end of this, Teddy says, this box doesn't look or smell like a treat. Maybe it's not actually a treat. He engages System 2, and System 2 says, you're right, that's absurd. Let's experiment on a small piece. So now we're finding ways to adjust and find, to probe. Questions about anchoring? Thoughts about anchoring? 30 minutes left, huh? You guys got here early. Okay. Availability. Adjust anchoring. Set your expectations. Of course, I didn't really say what early means.
Why do you break that up?
Yeah, I'm not going to. Availability. So in availability bias, Ted's going to say, hey, we're going for a ride. We must be going to the dog park again. He's excited. I trust you. You got this. Here's the thing, though, guys. What Teddy doesn't realize is that we also use the car to take him to the vet. But because he goes to the dog park all the time, that's what he's thinking about. Yeah, some dogs are smart enough to know when you turn the wrong way that you're not going to the dog park. So availability kind of can come up in several different ways. It's really about believing something to be true because instances of it easily come to mind. So it's not just about having happened a lot or having happened recently. It's about things that we can recall easily. They come to mind very easily. It kind of breaks down into these 3 pieces. Salient, which is like popular events, things that happen currently, and they're current. Dramatic, things that are very traumatic for us, or personal experience. So like salient would be something like, all politicians are corrupt. All politicians, they're all corrupt. We just assume that's true. Or dramatic events would be like a plane crash. If you have a plane crash, it doesn't necessarily have to happen recently, but it's pretty dramatic, and you might have a fear of flying because of that. My wife wouldn't fly for ages after 9/11. She just wouldn't get on a plane. If they're personal or vivid, one of the ways I kind of related this for me, may not be for you guys, but whenever I get a speeding ticket in a particular location, I never speed in that location again. Even though I've never seen a police officer there before in my entire life, or again, since that time, I'll never speed there again. It's a personal experience, and we assume that everybody should then be careful there too, because I got a ticket there once. But there's lots of ways to measure that. I went to a restaurant and I got bad service once. It's a terrible restaurant. You should never go there. Let's see. One of the things that I will say, by the way, these kinds of availability biases can be about people too, not just about situations. So that's something to be careful of. We think that all IT people are introverts, or we think that all accountants are frugal, or if we think that all HR people are evil. We got to be careful about that because those biases really aren't true. If you read Dilbert, that doesn't make it true. The other place that we've got to be really careful about availability is social media. Social media can make things much more available than they really are, appear much more available than they really are. And all you gotta do is spend 3 minutes on Twitter, and you know that. So be very careful when you're forming opinions about availability bias on social media. So how can we fix this? Metrics are really important in this. One of the things that we can do is talk about metrics. They're empirical. One of the great examples of this is small business owners. How many of you have heard before that 90% of small businesses fail? You ever heard that? Okay, do you think anybody would ever go into business if they believe that? They would never start their own small business. So every small business owner discounts that. We're fine. But what they ought to be doing is saying, okay, so if there's a really high failure rate, why? Why is there a really high failure rate? How do we start probing and figuring out how not to fall into the trap that 90% of businesses fall into? So reflecting is really important, obviously. We want to make sure that we're asking ourselves reflective questions. Is this true? Are HR people really evil? No. I know HR people, they're not evil. The fast brain will jump on a perceived trend, but the slow brain will process the issues. Yeah, always question your assumptions based on availability. Is flying still the safest form of travel? Yes. Just because a plane crashed once, more than once, doesn't make it an unsafe ability to travel. So, in the end, what we have is Ted saying, we're going for a ride. Do you think we're going to the dog park again? And we've engaged System 2 now, says, we could be, but it's also been a long time since we've been to the vet. So, System 2 engages and starts kind of analyzing. Thoughts or questions about that? Availability? Availability bias? All right. The law of small numbers. So what is this bias? The law of small numbers. Law of small numbers says, Ted saying, the guy in the lab coat sticks me with needles. So I bark at all people wearing lab coats. Now Ted doesn't have a lot of experience with lab coats, but System 2 says, seems reasonable, I'm going back to sleep. So how do we engage System 2? Well, so one example of this small number bias is this statement right here. Rural, sparsely populated, traditional Republican states in the Midwest, the South, and West have the lowest rates of kidney cancer in the U.S. Studies have proved this. Rural, sparsely populated, traditionally Republican states in the Midwest, South, and West have the highest rates of kidney cancer in the U.S. Studies have also proved this. Why? Because when you're in a rural area, you don't have a big enough sample size to get accurate data. Large sample sizes are more precise. It may, right? But we use small sample size all the time in little ways to make judgments about what we're evaluating. They can yield extreme results. And something to think about here is, small sample sizes don't just help us prove a false hypothesis, but they can actually also help us disprove a factual hypothesis. Because if you use a small sample size, even though what you hypothesized is correct, your small sample size may reveal that it's not, say that it's not. So you gotta be careful with that. Small sample size errors are a problem when we estimate, especially with new projects, new team members, or even when teams change. And this is important for us because teams change a lot around here. So when you bring in a new team member, they are now estimating on a very small sample size, or none at all, potentially. And their opinion can influence the estimate. So be thinking about how you can improve your estimating. For us, the first iteration, how big is your sample size? Nothing, right? Nothing. You don't have anything to base your sample on. So be aware of that. When you estimate in that first iteration, it's not going to be very accurate. Prepare everybody for that possibility. As you move on down the road and you get to your 15th or 20th iteration, now you can start to think, all right, now we've got a better sample size. But then if you lose a team member, or you lose 2 team members, you have to replace them, guess what? You're starting that process over again. So, in order to kind of combat the small number bias, Teddy needs to ask, there's a guy in a white lab coat, should I be afraid? And at that point, when System 2 is engaged, he'll say, are we at the vet? No, then this lab coat guy is probably okay. He's a butcher. One thing I want to emphasize to everybody is that we absolutely need to have both systems. We've kind of talked a lot about how bad System 1 is all throughout, but I need you to realize that System 1 is absolutely critical because we cannot pay attention to everything. We can't pay attention to everything. We need both. I don't know why that did that. No. We need both. And a good example of this for me, it was one of the ones that I read that I thought, oh, yeah, that makes great sense, is you look at teen drivers. Teen drivers lack experience. They are engaging their System 2, they're engaging their slow brain much more often because when they come up on a yellow light, they have a lot of things that they have to be intentionally analyzing. Should I go? Is there a car in the intersection? Is there a cop around? Is there a car in front of me? Is there a car behind me? Is there a pedestrian in the crosswalk? Oh wait, I'm through the, oh shit, I guess I'm going. Hopefully I don't hit anybody. That's, new drivers go through that. As we gain more experience, that stuff becomes more instinctual. We've got to have both because we can't go through life driving around, evaluating critically everything we see when we drive. We need both systems. They're important. But it's important to know when we need to engage our slow system. And that's the real challenge. How are we constantly asking ourselves, do we need to wake up System 2? Some strategies that we can deploy: mindfulness meditation. That's what that says. It's weird. It says mind med in my notes. These are Brett's notes. System 1 can be trained to wake up System 2. This is kind of what we were talking about throughout. It won't like to wake up, but we can force it to. Let me state this. Sometimes you have to be intentional about that. So sometimes you actually have to force yourself to think through what's going on. When your teenage daughter comes home 30 minutes late at night, should you immediately start yelling at them because they're late? Or should you probe first and ask them what's going on? Maybe there was an accident, maybe there's an emergency. So how do you train yourself to be that way instead of, depends on how much sleep you've had probably. We're going to group, we talked about this earlier, we're much better at detecting biases in other people than we are at detecting biases on our own. So lean on others to help you. My wife has to lean on me all the time, so I can check her. Oh wait, maybe it's fine, okay, whatever. Writing things down is also another great way to engage System 2. When you, how many people in here take notes in meetings, like pretty good? Do you take notes for the team or do you take notes for yourself? Yeah, because it helps you remember and write things down. You're forcefully engaging System 2 instead of checking out on the conversation. Even if you think you're listening, by writing it down, you're forcing yourself to engage System 2 and commit things. So, oh, I'm supposed to be clicking on this button the whole time. Be agile is another way to do this. Just the way we often think. I mean, agility is often about engaging System 2. It's about asking ourselves, should we be doing this or shouldn't we? And so, just kind of that mindset, engaging System 2, just a probe, just quick. Should we be looking at this deeper is important. So I told you to get out of here early. Very early. Questions? Comments? Thoughts? Those were for Brett, not for me, so you can keep your skating with all this other stuff. Look there, one of the things that I could do, this book here, this is Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It is, as you saw by the quote that I pulled out, it's an intense read because it uses a lot of big language. But it's fascinating. There are dozens and dozens of examples of cognitive bias. We picked out a few that we think are important. I probably could have put in 6 more, except I didn't have time because I had to do the presentation. And this is the other book, one of the other books that Brett recommended. It's called Nudge. It's actually a really interesting read. It's a little bit lighter than that book. It covers many of the biases that are in Thinking Fast and Slow, but it does so from the perspective that the way we design things can help nudge people in one direction or the other, because people so often go through their lives without engaging system 2 that we often have to kind of nudge them in the right direction. So this is really important. For example, in an HR system, how do you set up the defaults for open enrollment, as an example? What nudges are you going to use so that when people go next, or when people don't even bother to sign up, what nudges are you going to move them in that direction? Should they sign up for health insurance or not? Should they contribute to 401k or not? So kind of think about that. Nudge was a really good read. It's a lot lighter than Thinking Fast and Slow, so I highly recommend that. And you now have an hour and 25 minutes for lunch. Unless there's questions I can help answer. All right, guys, thank you.